On a gray March morning in 1926, the wrought iron Vanderbilt gates at Fifth Avenue and West 57th Street stand half open, their scrollwork dark against a pale Manhattan sky. Beyond them, the Cornelius Vanderbilt II house, completed in 1883 at Vert West 57th Street, rises in tiers of brick and limestone, its chateau-esque roofline still bristling with dormers and chimneys. Inside the five-story entrance hall, the Augustus St. Gaudens mantel glows faintly in the filtered light, marble caryatids of Amer and Pax holding up a decorative universe that once made a New York Times writer remark that nothing can equal its magnificence in a decorative sense. Yet in the assessor's ledgers downtown, the mansion is no longer a home but a number: frontage, square footage, valuation, tax due. Alice Vanderbilt's trust strains to meet the yearly bill that now rivals the cost of running a small town. Outside, streetcars rattle, shopfronts creep closer, and the gates, designed to guard a private empire, already belong more to the city than to the family. Soon they will stand alone, remembering a house that the tax rolls quietly erased. In the spring of 1877, when Cornelius Vanderbilt II received word that his grandfather, the Commodore, had died, he inherited not merely $5 million, but a transformation of identity. The sum placed him instantly among New York's wealthiest men, though he stood well behind his father, William Henry Vanderbilt, who controlled the bulk of the railroad empire. Still, $5 million was enough to reshape the skyline, and within a year Cornelius began purchasing brownstones at the northwest corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street, a location that marked the northern edge of what society pages were beginning to call Millionaire's Row. He commissioned George B. Post, an architect trained at New York University and already known for his work on commercial buildings and private residences, to design a mansion that would announce the family's arrival not through understatement, but through architectural theater. The site itself required demolition of existing structures, modest row houses that had served middle-class families for decades. By 1878, those buildings were gone, their foundations cleared to bedrock, and Post's plans began to take shape on drafting tables downtown. The design was French Renaissance in inspiration, drawing explicitly on the chateau of the Loire Valley, but adapted to the vertical constraints and commercial energy of Manhattan. Steep mansard roofs crowned the structure, their slate tiles imported from quarries in Pennsylvania. Dormers punctuated the roofline, each framed in carved limestone that would weather to a pale gray over the coming decades. The facade combined warm red brick with Indiana limestone trim, creating a visual rhythm of horizontal bands that emphasized the building's mass while breaking it into comprehensible sections. Construction proceeded through 1879 and into the early 1880s. Masons laid brick and Flemish bond, a pattern that alternated headers and stretchers to create both structural integrity and decorative texture. Limestone carvers worked on site and in workshops across the city, chiseling acanthus leaves, scrollwork, and heraldic motifs that would frame windows and doors. The entrance, set back slightly from the street line, was designed as a deep porch sheltered by a stone archway. It was here that Post placed the gates, wrought iron, 10 feet tall, their vertical bars twisted and their crosspieces hammered into repoussé patterns of leaves and vines. By 1883, the first phase of the Cornelius Vanderbilt II house stood complete. Contemporary accounts describe it as imposing, but not yet the largest private residence in the city. That distinction would come later, after expansion. Early visitors noted the entrance hall, a soaring vertical space lined with Caen stone imported from Normandy, its pale cream color reflecting natural light that filtered through stained glass clear-story windows. The hall rose through multiple floors, creating an interior volume that dwarfed anything in the surrounding brownstones. Society columnists wrote about the house in language that mixed admiration with a faint note of unease. One described it as a monument to the railway fortune that built it, a phrase that acknowledged both the source of the money and the ambition embedded in every carved detail. Another noted that the mansion dominates its corner as surely as the Commodore dominated his competitors, drawing an explicit parallel between architectural scale and economic power. What these early accounts rarely mentioned was the fiscal infrastructure that made such buildings possible, and that would, in time, help bring them down. By the 1880s, American local governments drew the overwhelming majority of their revenue from property taxes. Land and improvements were assessed annually, and owners paid a percentage of that assessed value to fund schools, roads, police, fire protection, and all the other services that made urban life function. In New York, assessment practices were evolving to capture not just the physical value of structures, but their potential income-generating capacity and their location within the city's expanding commercial geography. The Vanderbilt House, occupying one of the most valuable corners in Manhattan, represented a substantial addition to the city's tax base. Contemporary municipal records, preserved in archives, show that Fifth Avenue properties in the 50s and 60s carried some of the highest per-square-foot assessments in the United States. Each new mansion along the avenue not only announced its owner's wealth, but also generated revenue streams that underwrote the city's infrastructure. In a very real sense, New York's expanding grid of paved streets, gas lamps, and police patrols was subsidized by the property taxes paid by men like Cornelius Vanderbilt II. The gates themselves became a minor subject of discussion in architectural journals. George Post had designed them to complement the overall aesthetic of the house. Renaissance forms filtered through late 19th century industrial fabrication techniques. The ironwork was both handcrafted and machine-assisted. Blacksmiths forged the basic elements in foundries, then finished the details by hand with hammers and files. The result was a barrier that appeared organic, almost vegetal, yet strong enough to withstand decades of New York weather. In photographs from the 1880s, the gates framed the entrance porch, their dark metal contrasting with the pale limestone. Beyond them, the heavy wooden doors, carved oak reinforced with iron straps, stand closed most hours of the day. The house was not designed for public access, but for controlled social performance. Visitors arrived by appointment, passed through the gates, and entered a world carefully curated to reflect Vanderbilt's status and taste. Inside, the rooms on the ground floor included a reception hall, library, and dining room, each paneled in different woods and decorated with imported textiles. The library featured walnut shelving and a carved mantelpiece. The dining room rose 2 stories, its walls covered in embossed leather and its ceiling coffered in oak. These spaces were recorded in architectural drawings held now at the New York Historical Society, their dimensions and materials documented with precision. Yet even as the house settled into its place on Fifth Avenue, the neighborhood around it was changing. By the mid-1880s, commercial establishments, hotels, clubs, specialty shops were beginning to migrate northward from the 40s. The intersection of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street, once comfortably residential, was becoming a threshold between 2 urban identities. This shift, barely perceptible at first, would accelerate over the coming decades, reshaping the economic and social meaning of the Vanderbilt property. The cost of the original construction is variously reported in contemporary sources, with figures ranging from $1 to $2 million. The discrepancy reflects both the difficulty of tracking expenditures across multiple contractors and the tendency of society pages to inflate or deflate sums depending on editorial stance. What is clear is that the house represented an enormous concentration of capital, money extracted from railroad operations and transformed into limestone, brick, and carved wood. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, in his early 40s when the house was completed, occupied it with his wife Alice Claypool, Gwynn Vanderbilt, and their growing family. Alice, described in period accounts as reserved but socially astute, understood that the house was not merely a home, but a platform for establishing the family's position within New York's carefully calibrated social hierarchy. The Vanderbilts were wealthy, but wealth alone did not guarantee acceptance among the old Knickerbocker families who claimed deeper roots in the city's history. The gates, in this context, served a dual function. They excluded the uninvited, marking the boundary between public street and private domain. But they also invited scrutiny, their ornate metalwork announcing that something significant lay beyond. Every passerby on Fifth Avenue could see the gates and, through them, the shadowed entrance porch. The house proclaimed itself without apology. In the assessor's office downtown, clerks recorded the dimensions of the property, the materials of construction, and an estimated value. The formulas they used were evolving as cities experimented with ways to tax not just the present use of land, but its potential future value. The Vanderbilt corner, already zoned for residential use, nonetheless sat at the edge of a commercial zone whose expansion seemed, even in the 1880s, almost inevitable. The assessed value thus reflected not only what the house was, but what the land beneath it might someday become. It was built to announce permanence, to declare that the Vanderbilt name, like the Vanderbilt fortune, would endure for generations. Yet the gates, even as they swung open for the first time, marked a threshold to a more complicated future. Every year the tax bill would arrive, every year the family would pay, and every year the city would use that revenue to build the infrastructure that would, in time, make Fifth Avenue too valuable for private palaces. Within a decade of moving into the house on Fifth Avenue, Cornelius Vanderbilt II concluded that it was no longer adequate. This was not a matter of function. The existing rooms more than accommodated the family's needs, but of competition and symbolism. By the early 1890s, other wealthy New Yorkers were building larger, more conspicuous mansions. His own relatives were constructing summer cottages in Newport that dwarfed the original Fifth Avenue house in scale and ostentation. To remain stationary in this context was to fall behind. So Cornelius began acquiring the remaining parcels along the block, purchasing adjacent properties and negotiating with holdouts until he controlled the entire frontage from 57th Street nearly to 58th Street. The demolition of existing buildings and the expansion of his own residence became the largest private construction project in Manhattan during the mid-1890s. He retained George B. Post as supervising architect, but also brought in Richard Morris Hunt, whose reputation had been secured by the breakers and other Newport commissions, to oversee the interior program and ensure that the expanded house would rival anything on the eastern seaboard. The result, completed in stages between 1892 and 1895, transformed the original mansion into the largest private residence in New York City. Architectural historians, working from building permits and insurance documents, estimate the final structure contained approximately 137 rooms spread over 6 floors, though the exact count varies depending on how service spaces and hallways are classified. The footprint expanded dramatically, filling nearly the entire block front with a mass of brick, limestone, and slate that rose in tiers from the street. The most dramatic interior space was the entrance hall, redesigned to soar through 5 stories. The walls were clad in Caen stone, a pale limestone from Normandy that aged to a warm cream color. The ceiling, far overhead, featured decorative plasterwork and was illuminated by clear-story windows that admitted filtered daylight during the day and by gas fixtures, later converted to electricity, at night. The spatial volume was cathedral-like, designed to overwhelm visitors the moment they crossed the threshold. Midway up one wall, installed during the expansion, was the Augustus St. Gaudens mantelpiece. Commissioned specifically for this location, the piece combined marble, mosaic, oak, and cast iron into a decorative ensemble that functioned as both fireplace surround and sculptural statement. 2 caryatids, female figures carved in high relief, flanked the hearth. They were identified in St. Gaudens' working drawings as Amor and Pax, love and peace, and their postures suggested both support and supplication. Their bowed heads and upraised arms bore a marble lintel carved with acanthus leaves and classical motifs. Above that rose a mosaic panel depicting allegorical figures in a garden, the tesserae small enough that from a distance the image appeared almost painted. Contemporary accounts described the mantelpiece in language that bordered on reverence. A writer for the New York Times, admitted to the house during a charity event in the late 1890s, wrote that nothing can equal its magnificence in a decorative sense, a statement that captures both the piece's aesthetic achievement and the excess it represented. The mantel was not necessary for heating. The house had a modern furnace and radiator system, but as a symbol of cultivated wealth and European artistic tradition transplanted to American soil. Other rooms in the expanded house followed similar logic. The ballroom, located on the second floor, rose 2 stories and could accommodate several hundred guests. Its walls were paneled in carved oak imported from England, and its ceiling featured plasterwork executed by French artisans working from Renaissance models. Massive chandeliers, crystal and bronze, each weighing hundreds of pounds, hung from reinforced ceiling mounts. When lit for evening events, the room glowed with a warm golden light that reflected off polished floors and gilded moldings. The dining room, also double height, functioned simultaneously as a space for meals and as a gallery for the family's art collection. Paintings, old masters and contemporary works acquired through dealers in New York and Europe, lined the walls between pilasters. The table, when fully extended, could seat 40 guests. Above, a musician's gallery allowed for a live performance during dinners, the sound of strings and woodwinds filtering down into the space below. Perhaps the most unusual room was the Moorish smoking room, designed by Jules Allard & Sons, the French decorating firm responsible for much of the interior detailing. The ceiling was a complex lattice of carved wood and plaster, painted in rich reds, blues, and golds, and incorporating a ventilation system that drew cigar smoke upward through decorative grills. The effect was both exotic and functional, a fantasy of Oriental architecture domesticated for the comfort of wealthy men who gathered after dinner to discuss business and politics. Service spaces, kitchens, pantries, laundries, servants' bedrooms occupied the upper floors and rear wings, connected by narrow staircases that allowed staff to move through the house without being seen by family or guests. The infrastructure required to maintain the residence was substantial. A full-time staff of dozens, including butlers, footmen, maids, cooks, laundresses, and maintenance workers. Payroll records preserved in estate archives show that the annual cost of staffing alone rivaled the operating budget of a small hotel. The architectural firm, Jules Allard & Sons, based in Paris but with a New York office, supplied much of the decorative detailing. Their workshops produced custom-carved paneling, plasterwork, and furniture that blended French historical styles, Louis XIV, Louis XV, Renaissance, with the specific requirements of American clients who wanted European grandeur but also modern conveniences. Allard's involvement in the Vanderbilt project was documented in invoices and shipping manifests, now held at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, showing the movement of materials and craftsmen across the Atlantic. The house, as completed in the mid-1890s, represented not just wealth but a particular vision of what wealth should look like. It was historically referential, drawing on French Renaissance chateaux, Italian palaces, and English manor houses, yet distinctly modern in its use of steel framing, electric lighting, and central heating. It was a hybrid, old forms made possible by new technologies, European aesthetics financed by American industrial capital. Contemporary critics, writing in architectural journals, noted this tension. One described the house as a monument to what money can buy, but not what it can create, a barbed comment that acknowledged the quality of craftsmanship while questioning the originality of vision. Another observed that the mansion owes everything to the past and nothing to the present, a line that captured the unease many felt about the Gilded Age's relentless borrowing from European architectural traditions. Yet for the Vanderbilts and their peers, this historicism was not a weakness, but a strength. To build in Renaissance or Gothic or neoclassical styles was to claim kinship with older aristocracies, to suggest that American wealth was not merely new money, but the rightful heir to centuries of Western culture. The imported paneling, the marble caryatids, the carved ceilings, all of it served to naturalize a social hierarchy that was, in fact, barely a generation old. The cost of the expansion and interior decoration is difficult to pin down precisely, as invoices and payments were spread across multiple years and contractors. And some estimates place the total outlay, original construction plus expansion, at over $10 million in period currency, a sum that would translate to hundreds of millions in early 21st century terms. Whether this figure is accurate or inflated by journalistic exaggeration is less important than what it represented, a commitment of resources so vast that maintaining the property would require an ongoing income stream sufficient to cover taxes, insurance, staff, utilities, and repairs. And taxes, even in the 1890s, were substantial. By the turn of the century, property taxes represented roughly 3/4 of local government revenue nationwide, and that proportion was even higher in urban centers like New York. The Vanderbilt house, assessed at a value that reflected both its construction cost and its prime location, generated an annual tax bill that ran into the tens of thousands of dollars. Records from the New York City Department of Finance, archived but fragmentary, suggest that the mansion was among the highest assessed private properties in the city. This tax burden was manageable for Cornelius Vanderbilt II during his lifetime, as he continued to draw income from the family's railroad holdings. But the logic of property taxation, tying annual obligations to assessed value rather than to income, meant that the house itself was a financial liability, a beautiful machine that consumed resources simply by existing. The more elaborately it was decorated, the higher its assessed value. The more valuable the surrounding neighborhood became, the more the city could justify raising assessments. In this way, the house was bound into an economic system that would, over time, exert relentless pressure toward redevelopment. The Vanderbilt Gate, still framing the main entrance, now opened onto a much larger architectural composition. Photographs from the late 1890s show the gates against the expanded facade, their 10-foot height dwarfed by the 6-story mass of brick and stone behind them. Yet they remained the threshold, the symbolic boundary between the public city and the private castle. Every guest who entered passed through those gates, experiencing the transition from street to entrance porch to soaring hall, a carefully choreographed sequence designed to inspire awe. Inside, the sound of the house was distinctive. The entrance hall's volume created an acoustic environment where footsteps echoed, conversations carried, and music from the musicians' gallery drifted through doorways into adjacent rooms. In letters and diary entries, preserved in family archives, visitors described this acoustic signature, a sense of space made audible, of grandeur that you could hear as well as see. The illusion, meticulously constructed, was of permanence. The carved stone, the imported woods, the mosaic and marble, all of it was designed to last centuries, to outlive not just Cornelius Vanderbilt II, but his children and grandchildren. Yet permanence, in architecture as in life, is always contingent. It depends on continued maintenance, on the capacity to pay taxes and insurance, on the willingness of heirs to preserve rather than liquidate. The house was built as if time could be defeated through sheer mass and craftsmanship. Time, patient and indifferent, had other plans. By the mid-1890s, the phenomenon of the American castle extended far beyond Fifth Avenue. From Newport to Philadelphia to the shores of Long Island Sound, industrialists and financiers were commissioning residences that rivaled European palaces in scale, cost, and ambition. These houses were not merely homes, they were statements of arrival, monuments to fortunes accumulated with unprecedented speed through railroads, steel, oil, banking, and stock speculation. The architecture borrowed unabashedly from the Old World, French chateaux, Italian villas, English country estates, but the money that built them was distinctly American, extracted from the engines of industrial capitalism. Cornelius Vanderbilt II himself commissioned the breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, engaging Richard Morris Hunt to design a summer cottage that would anchor the family's position at the apex of East Coast society. Completed in 1895, the breakers contained 70 rooms spread across 138,000 square feet. The exterior was Indiana limestone, pale and austere, punctuated by classical pilasters, and a roofline bristling with dormers and chimneys. The interior was an operatic display of materials and craftsmanship, alabaster columns in the Great Hall, mosaic ceilings executed by Italian artisans, carved wood paneling imported from Europe, and a symbolic program that wove together acorns, signifying strength, and dolphins, representing hospitality, in a decorative language that proclaimed both power and welcome. The cost, contemporary estimates suggested, exceeded $7 million, though final accounting is difficult to reconstruct. What is clear is that the breakers represented one of the most expensive private residences ever constructed in the United States up to that point, a benchmark that would be challenged only by a handful of other Gilded Age projects. In Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia, traction magnate Peter A. B. Widener engaged architect Horace Trumbauer to design Linwood Hall. Completed around 1899, the house was neoclassical in style, a white marble facade with Corinthian pilasters, a central portico, and symmetrical wings extending on either side. The interior included approximately 110 rooms, among them a grand ballroom capable of holding 1,000 guests, a two-story art gallery that housed Widener's collection of European paintings, and a conservatory filled with tropical plants. The estate originally encompassed 300 acres, landscaped with formal gardens, terraces, and a network of carriage drives. Widener's fortune derived from public transit, streetcar lines in Philadelphia and Chicago, and from investments in banking and oil. The accumulation had been rapid, and Linwood Hall was designed to convert that accumulation into cultural legitimacy. The art collection, featuring works by Rembrandt, Raphael, and Vermeer, was among the finest private holdings in the United States. After Widener's death in 1915, much of the collection would eventually be donated to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, but in the early decades of the 20th century, it remained in Elkins Park, a private museum accessible only to those granted admission. Nearby, another Philadelphia area financier, Edward T. Stotesbury, would later commission Trumbauer again for Whitemarsh Hall. Construction began in 1916 and continued through 1921, resulting in a 147-room mansion on 300 acres north of Philadelphia. The cost, including furnishings, was estimated at $10 million, a sum that contemporary observers noted could have built a small city. The house featured a Georgian facade, formal gardens designed by Jacques Graeber, indoor and outdoor swimming pools, and a staff of dozens required to maintain the estate. Contemporary photographs show a structure of almost overwhelming horizontality, its long wings and classical colonnades suggesting a transplanted English manor scaled up to American proportions. On Long Island's North Shore, in an area that would come to be known as the Gold Coast, Alva Belmont built Beacon Towers in Sands Point. Completed in 1918, the house was a Gothic fantasy. Turrets, crenellations, and pointed arch windows that evoked medieval castles filtered through early 20th century romanticism. Alva Belmont, formerly Alva Vanderbilt before her divorce from William Kissam Vanderbilt and remarriage to Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, was a prominent suffragist and socialite, and Beacon Towers reflected her theatrical sensibility. The house would later pass briefly through the hands of William Randolph Hearst, before economic pressures and rising property taxes made its maintenance untenable. It was demolished in 1945, less than 3 decades after completion. These houses, the Vanderbilt Mansion on Fifth Avenue, the Breakers, Linwood Hall, Whitemarsh Hall, Beacon Towers, formed a constellation of American castles, each serving as both private residence and public symbol. They announced the arrival of a new class whose wealth exceeded that of European aristocracies, and whose ambitions extended to every sphere of cultural and social life. The E's architecture was eclectic, borrowing freely across historical periods and national traditions, but the underlying message was consistent. Fortunes made in railroads, steel, and finance could purchase not only comfort but grandeur, not only houses but dynasties. Yet these castles, for all their solidity, existed within a fiscal and legal framework that was itself evolving. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, property tax remained the primary source of local government revenue. By the 1920s and into the 1930s, property taxes would account for more than 4/5 of local owned source revenue in American cities and towns. Every mansion, every estate, every landscaped acre represented taxable value, an asset on the owner's balance sheet, but also a line item in municipal budgets that funded schools, roads, police, and fire protection. In this sense, the castle served a dual function. They were private fantasies, expressions of individual ambition and taste, but they were also public goods, underwriting through their tax payments the civic infrastructure that made modern urban life possible. The very wealth that built the mansions also, through taxation, built the world beyond their gates. This relationship was rarely articulated explicitly in contemporary discourse, but it was implicit in every assessment, every tax bill, every municipal bond issued to fund street improvements or school construction. Economic historians, examining property tax records from the period, note that assessment practices varied widely by locality, but generally aimed to capture the market value of land and improvements. In rapidly growing cities like New York, assessments often lagged behind actual market values, creating windfall gains for property owners, but also political pressure to reassess more frequently and at higher valuations. By the early 20th century, reform movements were advocating for more scientific assessment methods, seeking to eliminate favoritism and ensure that the wealthiest property owners paid their proportional share. For the owners of America's castles, these reforms had direct consequences. Higher assessments meant higher tax bills, and higher tax bills meant that the ongoing cost of maintaining a large estate grew year by year. At the same time, the introduction of federal estate taxes in 1916, initially modest but gradually increasing, added another layer of fiscal pressure. Estates that had been designed to pass intact from one generation to the next now faced the prospect of being partially liquidated to pay taxes upon the death of the patriarch. The gates of these estates, literal and symbolic, thus marked boundaries that were increasingly porous. The public, excluded from entering, nonetheless claimed a share of the wealth concentrated behind those gates through taxation. And the architecture itself, designed to project permanence and dynastic ambition, was quietly being undermined by fiscal instruments that treated stone and land not as permanent fixtures, but as reservoirs of taxable value. At the Vanderbilt House on Fifth Avenue, the gates still swung open for guests arriving by carriage and later by automobile. Inside, the great hall still echoed with footsteps, the ballroom still glowed during evening entertainments, and the St. Gaudens mantelpiece still presided over gatherings that mixed culture, business, and social ambition. But in the assessor's office downtown, clerks were adjusting valuations upward as Fifth Avenue's commercial character became more pronounced. And in the offices of estate attorneys and trust managers, calculations were being made about how long such houses could be sustained on the income streams available to their owners. The castles stood, solid and apparently immovable, their foundations sunk deep into American soil. But beneath that solidity, forces were at work. Demographic shifts, changing tastes, fiscal pressures, legal reforms that would, over the coming decades, make many of these grand residences unsustainable. When Americans called them castles, they captured something essential. These were fortresses designed to protect and project wealth. But unlike European castles, which often stood for centuries, these American versions would prove vulnerable to a very different kind of siege. Not armies at the gates, but annual tax bills, estate duties, and the relentless mathematics of maintenance. By the turn of the 20th century, the Vanderbilt Gate on Fifth Avenue was already more than a decade old. Its ironwork, exposed to Manhattan weather, was beginning to show faint traces of rust in the crevices, though regular maintenance kept it presentable. The gate framed not just an entrance, but a threshold between two Americas, one that still believed great fortunes could build permanent monuments, and another, just beginning to emerge, that would insist those fortunes owed something substantial back to the public realm from which they had been extracted. In the late 1890s, during the years when the expanded Cornelius Vanderbilt II house reached its fullest expression, the mansion functioned less as a domestic space than as a theater for the performance of wealth. The ballroom, 2 stories high and paneled in imported oak, became a stage where New York society enacted its rituals. Crystal chandeliers, each weighing several hundred pounds and holding dozens of electric bulbs, cast a warm light across polished floors. Guests arrived in evening dress, their arrivals timed and announced by footmen stationed in the entrance hall. The sound of their footsteps on marble, the rustle of silk gowns, the low hum of conversation. All of it was choreographed, intentional, part of a larger performance of social order and legitimacy. The double-height dining room served simultaneously as a gallery for the family's art collection. Paintings by European masters, acquired through dealers in New York, London, and Paris, hung between pilasters on walls covered in embossed leather. The table, when fully extended, could accommodate 40 guests seated in high-backed chairs carved with the Vanderbilt crest. Above, a musician's gallery allowed for live accompaniment during dinners. The sound of strings and piano filtering down into the space below added an auditory layer to the visual spectacle. Light in these rooms was carefully controlled. During the day, heavy curtains filtered sunlight to protect fabrics and paintings. In the evening, gas fixtures, and later, after electrification, incandescent bulbs, were lit in sequence to create pools of illumination that highlighted architectural details and flattered guests' complexions. The effect was both intimate and grand, suggesting a space designed for human interaction but scaled beyond ordinary domestic proportions. Society columns in the New York Times, the Herald, and other papers of record-tracked events at the Vanderbilt House with a combination of admiration and voyeuristic detail. A charity ball in 1897 drew several hundred guests and raised thousands of dollars for a hospital. The event was described in the press as a triumph of taste and organization, language that subtly acknowledged Alice Vanderbilt's role as both hostess and social strategist. A musical in 1898 featuring a visiting European soprano was noted for the exquisite acoustics of the ballroom and the discriminating audience that filled it. Alice Claypool Gwynn Vanderbilt, Cornelius's wife, understood the house as a tool. She was not merely its occupant, but its director, managing staff, coordinating events, and curating the guest lists that determined who would and would not be admitted through the Vanderbilt Gate. Contemporary accounts describe her as reserved in public but formidable in private, a woman who wielded social power with precision. Her role was not incidental to the house's function, it was essential. Without her labor, unpaid, unacknowledged in most histories, but documented in surviving correspondence and household records, the mansion would have been merely an empty shell. The staff required to maintain this performance was extensive. Household employment records, preserved in estate archives, list butlers, footmen, maids, cooks, laundresses, and maintenance workers, several dozen people in total. They occupied the upper floors and rear wings, connected to the main rooms by narrow service staircases that allowed them to move through the house without being seen by family or guests. Their work was physically demanding and carefully regimented, polishing floors, cleaning chandeliers, maintaining the furnace and plumbing systems, preparing meals, laundering linens, and performing the thousand small tasks required to keep the illusion of effortless grandeur intact. Payroll records suggest that the annual cost of staffing alone ran into tens of thousands of dollars, a sum that does not include the cost of food, uniforms, or the infrastructure required to house and manage such a workforce. The house, in this sense, was an economic engine, converting capital into wages, goods, and services that rippled through the surrounding economy. Yet beyond the mansion's walls, this concentration of wealth and the social rituals it enabled were becoming subjects of critique. By the 1890s, reformers and labor activists were arguing that Gilded Age fortunes represented not just individual success, but systemic exploitation. Wealth extracted from underpaid workers, monopolistic business practices, and speculative manipulation of financial markets. Publications like Progress and Poverty by Henry George, first published in 1879, argued that land values and unearned increments should be heavily taxed to capture socially created wealth and prevent the emergence of a permanent aristocracy. These arguments did not immediately translate into policy, but they shaped public discourse. Early debates over income and estate taxation, which would culminate in the passage of the federal estate tax in 1916, explicitly referenced concerns about dynastic wealth and its threat to democratic institutions. The Vanderbilt House and others like it were not merely architectural subjects, but political symbols, evidence for critics of an unhealthy concentration of power. For the Vanderbilts and their peers, the house was a defense against such critiques. By opening the mansion for charity events, by patronizing artists and musicians, by employing dozens of workers, they sought to present wealth not as hoarding, but as stewardship. The architecture itself reinforced this message. The imported materials, the European craftsmen, the historical references, all of it suggested that American industrial fortunes were not vulgar, but cultivated, not destructive, but civilizing. Photographs from the period, some preserved in the Museum of the City of New York's collections, capture moments from these events. In one image, women in elaborate gowns stand clustered in the entrance hall, their figures dwarfed by the soaring can stone walls and the St. Gaudens mantelpiece behind them. In another, the ballroom is filled with guests, the chandeliers ablaze, the oak paneling glowing in the warm light. These images were often staged for publication, intended to be seen by a broader public who would never cross the threshold, but whose perceptions of the Vanderbilts mattered nonetheless. The St. Gaudens mantelpiece, in particular, became a focal point for interpretation. Amor and Pax, the marble caryatids, were described in period accounts as representing the civilizing power of wealth, love, and peace upheld by prosperity. The symbolism was not subtle, and contemporary critics did not miss its implications. One writer, in a sardonic editorial, noted that the Vanderbilts have carved their motto in marble, that wealth, properly displayed, can buy both love and peace, a line that captured the tension between the family's self-presentation and the public's skepticism. Yet, for all the spectacle, the house was also a place where real human drama unfolded. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's health began to decline in the late 1890s. He suffered a stroke in 1896, which left him partially paralyzed, and though he lingered for 3 more years, his active role in business and society diminished. The entrance hall, designed for grand arrivals, now echoed with the sound of his slow, assisted movements. The ballroom, scene of so many performances, fell silent more often as the family withdrew from public life. When Cornelius died in September 1899, the house became a stage for mourning. The funeral, held in the ballroom, drew hundreds of mourners, including business leaders, politicians, and members of New York's social elite. Newspaper accounts described the scene in language that mixed solemnity with social observation, the floral arrangements, the eulogies, the procession of carriages that lined Fifth Avenue. The St. Gaudens mantelpiece, glimpsed in the background of published illustrations, presided over the ceremony, its caryatids now seeming to mourn rather than celebrate. Alice Vanderbilt inherited a complex legacy. Cornelius had established a trust that provided her with approximately $250,000 per year and lifetime use of both the Fifth Avenue house and the breakers in Newport. Contemporary financial analyses, preserved in legal documents, noted that this income was sufficient to maintain both properties, pay staff, and cover ongoing costs, but only just. There was little margin for unexpected expenses, major repairs, or increases in property taxes. The trust structure was designed to protect the estate from dissipation, ensuring that the principal remained intact for future generations. But it also created rigidity. Alice could not sell either property without court approval, could not significantly reduce staff without undermining the house's functions, and could not avoid the annual tax bills that arrived with clockwork regularity. The houses, in a sense, owned her as much as she owned them. Every chandelier in the ballroom burned on coal-fired electricity generated in the house's basement power plant. Every perfectly waxed floor reflected not only light but the invisible cost of keeping the spectacle alive. The silence inside the mansion, when empty, was a different kind of performance, a reminder that grandeur is always contingent, always dependent on the continuous application of labor, capital, and will. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1899, his passing triggered a sequence of legal and financial mechanisms that would gradually reshape the fate of his 2 largest properties. The will, drafted with care by estate attorneys, established a trust valued at approximately $7 million, designed to provide Alice with income sufficient to maintain both the Fifth Avenue mansion and the breakers while preserving the principal for eventual distribution to heirs. The arithmetic appeared sound. An annual yield of roughly $250,000 could, in theory, cover property taxes, insurance, staff salaries, utilities, maintenance, and the other fixed costs associated with two of the largest private residences in the United States. In practice, the margins were thinner than the legal documents suggested. Property taxes on the Fifth Avenue house alone, assessed on a value that reflected both the building's construction cost and its prime location, ran into tens of thousands of dollars per year. The Breakers, though located in a less commercially intense neighborhood, carried its own substantial tax burden. Insurance costs, reflecting the enormous replacement value of the structures and their contents, added another layer of expense. Staff salaries, relatively modest on an individual basis, accumulated into substantial annual outlays when multiplied across dozens of employees at each property. Alice Vanderbilt, now a widow in her late 40s, found herself managing not just two houses, but two complex economic enterprises. Household account books, preserved in family archives and later donated to research libraries, show the granular detail of these operations. Invoices for coal, receipts for laundry services, payroll ledgers listing each employee by name and wage, maintenance contracts for plumbing and electrical systems. The daily management fell to staff, but the strategic decisions, whether to undertake a major repair, whether to close one property for part of the year, how to negotiate with tax assessors, required Alice's attention. At the same time, the fiscal landscape within which these decisions were made was shifting. In 1913, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution authorized a federal income tax, introducing a new layer of taxation that affected wealthy families directly. Though initial rates were modest, the precedent was significant. For the first time, the federal government had a permanent mechanism to tax income, not just tariffs or excise duties. More consequential for estates like the Vanderbilts was the introduction of a federal estate tax in 1916. Enacted to help finance American preparation for potential involvement in World War I and to address concerns about dynastic wealth, the tax imposed duties on the transfer of property at death. The initial rates were low and the exemptions high enough that only the wealthiest estates were affected. But the principle was established. Large accumulations of wealth would not pass intact from generation to generation. Each transition would trigger a reckoning, a forced liquidation of some portion of the estate to satisfy tax obligations. Contemporary debates over the estate tax were explicitly framed in terms of preventing the emergence of an American aristocracy. Proponents argued that great fortunes, left unchecked, threatened democratic institutions by concentrating political and economic power in the hands of a few families. Opponents warned of confiscation, of penalizing success, of driving capital and talent abroad. The Vanderbilt House and others like it sat squarely within this debate, symbols of what was at stake. Intellectual currents of the progressive era reinforced these concerns. Henry George's arguments in Progress and Poverty, though never fully translated into policy, had reshaped public attitudes toward wealth and property. George had proposed a single tax on land values, arguing that the unearned increment resulting from population growth and infrastructure improvements should be captured by the community rather than accruing entirely to private landowners. While his specific proposal was never adopted, the underlying logic that private property exists within a social context and owes obligations to that context gained traction. For Alice Vanderbilt, these intellectual and policy shifts were not abstract. Each year, when property tax bills arrived, she confronted the reality that the houses she inhabited were not merely hers but belonged, in a sense, to the city and state whose services made them valuable. Each time she reviewed estate plans, she had to account for the possibility that federal taxes would, upon her death, require liquidation of assets. The houses had been built as monuments to permanence, but the legal and fiscal framework surrounding them treated them as assets to be taxed, divided, and eventually redistributed. Inside the Fifth Avenue mansion, the sound of daily life changed. Without Cornelius, the house no longer hosted the business meetings and strategic gatherings that had once filled the library and smoking room. Alice continued to entertain, but less frequently, and the events she did host were often charitable rather than purely social. The ballroom, scene of so many performances during the 1890s, stood empty more often, its chandeliers dark, its polished floors reflecting only daylight that filtered through curtained windows. The entrance hall, that soaring vertical canyon of Caen stone, now echoed differently. The St. Gaudens mantelpiece, with its caryatids of Amor and Pax, presided over a space that felt increasingly like a memorial rather than a living room. Photographs from this period, taken during rare public openings or for architectural documentation, show a house that appears frozen, beautiful, meticulously maintained, but somehow removed from the flow of ordinary time. Estate inventories, compiled for tax and probate purposes, cataloged the contents of the house with bureaucratic precision. Paintings were listed by artist and appraised value. Furniture was described by style, material, and provenance. The decorative objects, vases, sculptures, tapestries, were enumerated and valued. These documents, preserved in archives, reveal the house as an accumulation of assets, each item convertible to cash if necessary. The marble and oak, the silk and crystal, all of it existed within a framework that treated beauty as a form of wealth, subject to assessment, taxation, and potential liquidation. Alice donated some items to museums during these years, a strategy that served multiple purposes. It reduced the taxable value of the estate, secured tax deductions under emerging charitable giving provisions, and ensured that important pieces would be preserved and publicly accessible. The Metropolitan Museum of Art received paintings, decorative objects, and, eventually, the St. Gaudens mantelpiece itself, though that final donation would come later in the 1920s when the house's fate was sealed. Property tax assessments on the Fifth Avenue mansion continued to reflect not just the building's replacement value, but its location within an increasingly commercial district. By the early 1900s, department stores, hotels, and office buildings were spreading northward from Midtown Manhattan. The residential character of Upper Fifth Avenue was eroding, and with it, the logic that had once made the area suitable for grand private residences. Land values rose, driven by speculation and demand for commercial development. Property tax assessments, which tracked market values with varying degrees of accuracy and timeliness, rose accordingly. For Alice, these rising assessments meant higher annual tax bills without any corresponding increase in income. The trust established by Cornelius provided a fixed annual amount, barring extraordinary investment gains. As taxes increased, the margin for other expenses, maintenance, staff, improvements, shrank. The arithmetic that had seemed sustainable in 1899 became, by the 1910s, increasingly precarious. Legal scholars studying property taxation during this period note the inherent tension in the system. Property taxes are levied on assessed value, not on income or ability to pay. A homeowner whose house appreciates significantly in value faces higher taxes regardless of whether their income has increased. For commercial properties, where rising values typically reflect rising rents and income, this is manageable. For owner-occupied residential properties, especially large ones whose upkeep is expensive and whose income-generating capacity is nil, it can become unsustainable. The Vanderbilt house was an extreme case of this dynamic. Its assessed value reflected its location, size, and construction quality, factors that made it immensely expensive to own. But it generated no income. It was, in economic terms, a pure consumption good. The only way to convert it to income-producing use would be to lease it or subdivide it, options that were legally and practically difficult given the trust structure and the house's physical configuration. The alternative, to sell the property, required court approval and would mean losing the residence entirely. For the first time, the law was treating houses like the Vanderbilt mansion not as permanent family monuments, but as reservoirs of taxable value, granite and marble, that could, in theory, be slowly melted back into the public realm through annual taxation and eventual estate duties. The gates outside, still standing, now marked not just a boundary between private and public space, but a threshold where two different conceptions of property met and contested. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the daily operation of the Cornelius Vanderbilt II house required the labor of dozens of people whose names rarely appeared in public records, but whose work was essential to maintaining the illusion of effortless grandeur. They lived in small rooms on the upper floors and in the service wings, spaces that were functional rather than decorative, plain plaster walls, narrow beds, shared bathrooms. Their days began before dawn and extended long into the evening, especially when the house was hosting an event. The hierarchical structure of the household staff mirrored the social hierarchies of the period. At the top were the butler and housekeeper, who managed other employees and interfaced with Alice Vanderbilt on matters requiring her attention. Below them came footmen, ladies' maids, cooks, kitchen maids, laundresses, and at the bottom of the hierarchy, scullery maids and maintenance workers. Each position had defined duties. Each person knew their place and their responsibilities. Crossing these boundaries, or failing to perform to expected standards, could mean dismissal without much recourse. Architectural drawings preserved in archives show the spatial segregation built into the house's design. Service staircases, narrow and steep, connected the staff areas to the main rooms, allowing servants to move through the building without being seen by family or guests. The kitchen, located in the basement along with laundry facilities and storage, was connected to the dining room by a dumbwaiter and a servant's passage. Food traveled upward from the heat and noise of the kitchen to the refined elegance of the dining room, carried by footmen who entered silently, served, and withdrew. The physical demands of maintaining such a house were considerable. Floors had to be waxed and polished regularly. Windows, numbering in the dozens, required cleaning. The massive chandeliers in the ballroom had to be lowered periodically so that each crystal pendant could be washed by hand. Carpets and draperies, vulnerable to dust and soot from coal-burning furnaces and the city's industrial atmosphere, needed constant attention. In winter, the furnace required tending, coal had to be shoveled and ashes removed. In summer, awnings were deployed, heavy curtains changed for lighter ones, and rooms aired out. All of this labor was compensated at rates that, while reasonable by the standards of the day, were modest compared to the wealth that surrounded the workers. Payroll records suggest that a footman might earn $20 to $30 per month plus room and board. A cook, more skilled and harder to replace, might earn twice that. The butler, at the apex of the staff hierarchy, commanded a salary that was comfortable but still a tiny fraction of the household's overall operating budget. Yet this labor was not merely instrumental, it was also expressive. The smooth functioning of the household, the perfectly set table, the polished silver, the fresh flowers arranged in vases throughout the main rooms, communicated wealth and taste as surely as the architecture itself. In a sense, the staff were performers in the ongoing theater of Gilded Age social life, their invisibility when performing their duties paradoxically essential to the effect they created. Outside the mansion, Fifth Avenue was changing. By the 1910s, the stretch between 50th and 60th Streets was becoming less uniformly residential. Clubs, hotels, and specialty shops were interspersed among the remaining private houses. Traffic increased, carriages giving way gradually to automobiles, the sound of hooves on pavement mixing with the noise of internal combustion engines. The sidewalks were busier, the tempo of the neighborhood faster. The Vanderbilt house, with its high walls and gates, was increasingly an anomaly, a pocket of 19th century domesticity in a district becoming defined by 20th century commerce. This transformation had direct fiscal consequences. As the neighborhood commercialized, property values rose. Land that had been valued for its residential amenities, quietness, proximity to Central Park, prestige, was now valued for its commercial potential. Assessors working for the city revised valuations upward to reflect these changing realities. The Vanderbilt property, occupying a prime corner with substantial frontage, was particularly affected. Each reassessment brought higher taxes. Each higher tax bill put additional pressure on Alice Vanderbilt's fixed income. Economic historians analyzing property taxation during this period emphasize that assessments are not merely passive reflections of market value, but active instruments of fiscal policy. Cities depend on property taxes to fund schools, infrastructure, and services. When land uses change, assessors are incentivized to capture rising values to expand the tax base. In effect, property taxes create a built-in pressure for land to be put to its highest and best use, a phrase that, in urban contexts, typically means commercial development rather than private residential use. For Alice Vanderbilt, this pressure was not abstract. Each year, when the tax bill arrived, she faced a choice: pay from the trust's income, reducing funds available for maintenance and other expenses, or challenge the assessment, which required legal representation and offered uncertain prospects of success. Records do not indicate that she contested the assessments, suggesting either that she accepted them as inevitable or that her advisors counseled against the expense and uncertainty of appeal. Inside the house, the sound of the city penetrated more frequently. Automobile horns, the rattle of streetcars, the noise of construction, all of it filtered through the walls and windows. The entrance hall, designed to be a sanctuary from the street, could no longer fully exclude the urban soundscape. At night, electric lights from surrounding buildings cast new patterns of illumination and shadow across the facade. The house was becoming an island surrounded by a rising tide of commercial activity. The fiscal relationship between the house and the city was morally ambiguous. Critics of inequality argued that high property and estate taxes were minimal correctives to fortunes built on monopolistic practices and the exploitation of labor. Defenders of property rights warned that excessive taxation amounted to confiscation, penalizing success and discouraging investment. The Vanderbilt house existed precisely within this tension, a symbol of excess, certainly, but also a pillar of municipal finance. From the sidewalk, the Vanderbilt Gate was both barrier and benefactor. It marked a zone off-limits to most New Yorkers. Ordinary people could walk past, could gaze through the ironwork at the shadowed entrance porch beyond, but could not enter unless invited. Yet the taxes levied on the land behind that gate helped fund the public schools their children attended, the police who patrolled their streets, the fire department that protected their homes. The mansion's presence on the tax rolls contributed to the broader functioning of urban governance. This dynamic was rarely articulated in such explicit terms during the period. Property taxation was accepted as a necessary part of civic life, and debates focused more on specific rates and assessment methods than on the underlying principle. But the principle was profound. Private property, no matter how grand, existed within a social and legal framework that claimed a portion of its value for the common good. Inside the house, Alice Vanderbilt navigated these complexities with the assistance of lawyers, accountants, and estate managers. Her correspondence, portions of which have been preserved and digitized, reveals a woman attentive to detail, concerned about costs, and increasingly aware that the world her husband had built was becoming unsustainable. In letters to family members and advisors, she discussed the possibility of spending more time in Newport and less in New York, of closing parts of the Fifth Avenue house to reduce heating and maintenance costs, of scaling back the staff. These were small adjustments, tactical retreats rather than strategic surrender, but they indicated a recognition that the arithmetic was not working. The house consumed resources at a rate that her income, however substantial by any ordinary measure, could not indefinitely sustain. The trust that Cornelius had established, designed to be permanent, was proving insufficient to maintain the architectural monument he had built. The same city that envied the house also quietly depended on it. The same gate that excluded the many helped fund the streets they walked. This paradox, that great private wealth contributed to public capacity even as it symbolized private excess, defined the Gilded Age and its aftermath. The Vanderbilt house, solid and imposing, was both a fortress and a tributary, both a symbol of individual achievement and a resource for collective need. How long it could sustain this dual identity remained an open question, but by the 1920s, the answer was becoming clear. By the early 1920s, the stretch of Fifth Avenue where the Cornelius Vanderbilt II house stood had completed its transformation from residential boulevard to commercial corridor. Department stores anchored the blocks to the south: Bergdorf Goodman, already established and expanding, Bonwit Teller, Saks, Fifth Avenue. Hotels rose nearby, their upper floors offering views over Central Park. Office buildings, designed in the emerging setback style required by the 1916 zoning law, cast long shadows across sidewalks that had once been lined primarily with mansion facades. The Vanderbilt house, occupying its corner at 57th Street, appeared increasingly out of place. Architectural guidebooks from the period describe it with a mixture of admiration and puzzlement. One calls it a magnificent anachronism, acknowledging the quality of its design and construction while noting that its function, as a private single-family residence, no longer aligned with the district's economic character. Another refers to it as the last of the great Fifth Avenue palaces, a phrase that unintentionally predicts its demolition. Analyses of the house's situation, written by architectural historians in later decades, identify several converging pressures. First, the assessed value of the property continued to rise as commercial land values in the area soared. Tax bills followed those assessments upward. Second, the cost of maintaining the house, staff, utilities, insurance, repairs, was not declining and in some categories was increasing as older systems required replacement. Third, Alice Vanderbilt's income from the trust remained essentially fixed, barring extraordinary investment returns. Fourth, the neighborhood was no longer congenial to quiet residential life. The noise, traffic, and pace of activity made the house less pleasant to occupy, even if finances had not been a concern. Contemporary observers noted that the land beneath the house was now worth far more than the structure itself. This is a common dynamic in urban real estate. As areas densify and commercialize, old buildings, no matter how beautiful or historically significant, become obstacles to realizing the full economic potential of their sites. Developers looking at the Vanderbilt property saw not a mansion, but a prime retail location, ideally situated at the intersection of 5th Avenue and 57th Street, with frontage, visibility, and access to wealthy shoppers. Property tax assessments reflect this commercial valuation. Even though the house remained in residential use, assessors valued it based on what the land could generate if put to commercial use. This practice, known as valuing property at its highest and best use, is standard in American property taxation, but creates particular pressure on landowners whose actual use of a property differs from its theoretical optimal use. In effect, Alice Vanderbilt was being taxed as if she were operating a department store, even though she was simply living in her late husband's house. Inside, the mansion's routines continued, but with less frequency and vitality. The Great Ballroom hosted no grand entertainments during this period. Contemporary accounts note that the Vanderbilt social presence had shifted primarily to Newport, where the Breakers remained the center of summer society. The Fifth Avenue house was occupied during the winter months, but it functioned more as a residence than as a stage for the performances that had once filled its rooms. The staff was gradually reduced. Positions left vacant by retirement or resignation were not always filled. Rooms in the service wings stood empty. The house, designed to be animated by dozens of people moving through its corridors and staircases, grew quieter. In photographs from the early 1920s, taken for architectural documentation or insurance purposes, the interiors appear immaculate, but strangely still. Beautiful spaces waiting for uses that no longer came. The St. Gaudens mantelpiece, presiding over the entrance hall, was photographed and measured during this period by representatives from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The museum had been in discussions with Alice Vanderbilt about potential donations, and the mantelpiece, recognized even then as a masterpiece of American decorative art, was a priority. These preliminary surveys, documented in museum archives, suggest that by the early 1920s, Alice and her advisors were already contemplating the eventual disposition of the house and its contents. Financially, the situation was becoming untenable. Trust account statements preserved in estate records show that annual expenses were approaching or occasionally exceeding the trust's income. The shortfall could be covered, in the short term, by drawing on principal, but this eroded the financial base that the trust was designed to preserve. Legal restrictions on trust management made more aggressive strategies, selling off part of the property, subdividing the house, converting it to income-producing use, difficult or impossible without court approval. In 1925, correspondence between Alice Vanderbilt's attorneys and representatives of Brasted Realty Corporation indicates serious negotiations for the sale of the property. The discussions were confidential, but their substance eventually became public. Braested Realty was prepared to pay approximately $7 million for the land and building, with the intention of demolishing the mansion and constructing a commercial structure in its place. The decision Alice faced was not whether to sell, but when and on what terms. Staying in the house meant continuing to hemorrhage resources on property taxes, maintenance, and operating costs that no longer made economic sense. Selling meant accepting that the monument her husband had built, intended to outlast generations, would be erased within his widow's lifetime. It was a choice between financial sustainability and dynastic aspiration, between acknowledging reality and clinging to a vanishing world. In early 1926, Alice signed the papers. The sale was structured to close after she'd vacated the property and removed or donated the items she wished to preserve. News of the impending demolition appeared in New York newspapers that spring, prompting a wave of nostalgic commentary. Editorial writers described the house as the grandest in America and lamented the passing of an era. Architectural critics noted that the building had been finer than anything of its type in the country and expressed regret that it could not be preserved. Yet the tone of these commentaries was elegiac rather than angry. There was no sense that a crime was being committed, no call for public intervention to save the house. The predominant mood was acceptance tinged with sadness, a recognition that cities change, that economic forces are powerful, and that even the grandest private residences cannot withstand the combined pressure of taxes, changing tastes, and commercial development. Before the house closed for the final time, Alice arranged for it to be open to the public for a single day, with admission priced at 50 cents and proceeds donated to charity. Thousands of New Yorkers lined up outside the Vanderbilt Gate, many waiting hours for the chance to pass through and see the interiors they had glimpsed only in photographs. The event was covered extensively in the press, with reporters describing the long lines, the diversity of the crowd, working-class New Yorkers alongside society figures, and the quiet, respectful manner in which visitors moved through the rooms. For most of those visitors, it was the first and only time they would cross that threshold. The Vanderbilt Gate, designed to exclude, became for a day a turnstile admitting the public to a space that had always been private. The symbolism was not subtle. The house was being returned, in a sense, to the city from which it had been carved, open to the gaze of those whose taxes had helped support the civic infrastructure that surrounded it. Inside, the sound that day was unlike anything the house had known before, not the carefully modulated conversations of invited guests, but the murmur of hundreds of ordinary people moving through spaces designed to impress them. Their footsteps echoed in the entrance hall, their voices, low and sometimes awed, filled the ballroom. They studied the St. Gaudens mantelpiece, examined the carved oak paneling, stood beneath the chandeliers. For a few hours, the house belonged to everyone. Then, the doors closed, the public departed, and the work of dismantling began. In the winter of early 1926, after Alice Vanderbilt had vacated the Fifth Avenue house and transferred title to Braested Realty Corporation for approximately $7 million, the building entered a brief liminal state between life and death. The sale price reflected almost entirely the value of the land. Contemporary real estate analyses noted that the mansion itself added little to the property's worth from a commercial perspective. What mattered was the corner lot, the frontage on Fifth Avenue, the proximity to Central Park, and the potential to construct a high-value retail building on the site. The sale was reported in newspapers with a combination of factual detail and nostalgic commentary. The New York Times noted the dimensions of the house, approximately 137 rooms, 6 floors, occupying nearly an entire city block, and the price paid, emphasizing that it represented one of the largest real estate transactions in Manhattan's history. Editorial pages framed the demolition as inevitable, a consequence of changing urban economics rather than anyone's particular failure. The tone was regretful but unsentimental. The city was moving forward, and private palaces, however grand, could not stand in its way. Alice Vanderbilt, for her part, arranged the disposition of the house's contents with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her management of the property for more than 2 decades. The St. Gaudens mantelpiece, along with associated decorative panels and architectural elements from the entrance hall, was donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Museum records document the gift: marble, mosaic, oak, and cast iron mantelpiece and decorative surround, designed by Augustus St. Gaudens, gift of Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, 1925. The date indicates that negotiations had been underway well before the final sale of the house. Other items were dispersed differently. Some furniture and paintings went to family members. Other pieces were sold at auction, their provenance from the Cornelius Vanderbilt II residence, adding value and attracting collectors. The Vanderbilt Gate, those 10-foot-tall wrought iron panels that had framed the entrance since 1883, was offered to the city and eventually accepted, though it would be several years before the gates found their permanent home at the entrance to the Conservatory Garden in Central Park. In the spring of 1926, after the contents had been removed, the house stood empty for the first time since its completion. Photographers documenting the interiors before demolition captured images of extraordinary spaces stripped of their furnishings. The entrance hall, its caen stone walls rising 5 stories, looked even more vast without carpets and furniture to provide scale. The ballroom, empty of chandeliers and guests, was a shell of carved oak and plasterwork. The dining room, its walls bare of paintings, revealed the underlying structure: pilasters, moldings, the framework of an aesthetic program now partially erased. These photographs, preserved in archives including the Museum of the City of New York and the New York Historical Society, are haunting documents. They show architecture at the moment of its abandonment, still intact, but already ghostly. Light streams through windows onto floors that no one will walk again. Shadows pool in corners that will soon be rubble. The images are simultaneously records of what was built and previews of what will be lost. Demolition began in earnest in mid-1926 and continued into early 1927. The process was systematic and economically rational. Valuable materials were salvaged for resale, including marble, decorative metalwork, and portions of the carved wood paneling. Less valuable materials, brick, plaster, structural timbers, were broken up and hauled away. The sound was no longer the echo of footsteps on marble, but the crack of sledgehammers on stone, the grind of machinery pulling apart what had taken years to assemble. Newspaper coverage of the demolition mixed documentation with editorializing. One article described the scene as the end of an era, noting that the house had been the largest and arguably the finest private residence in New York City, and that its loss represented the final victory of commerce over domesticity on Fifth Avenue. Another piece focused on the economics, explaining that the land's value for commercial use far exceeded its value for residential purposes, and that property taxes based on commercial valuations had made continuing the house's original function financially impossible. Contemporary observers understood what was happening, even if they lacked the vocabulary that later historians would use to describe it. The demolition of the Vanderbilt house was not the result of revolution or war or natural disaster. It was the result of a quiet bureaucratic process, annual tax assessments that treated the property's potential commercial value as the basis for taxation, trust structures that limited the owner's flexibility, changing neighborhood character that made residential use less viable, and ultimately, the simple arithmetic that showed the house cost more to maintain than it was worth as a residence. By the end of 1927, the Cornelius Vanderbilt II house was gone. The site was cleared to ground level, the foundations dug out, and construction began on what would become the Bergdorf Goodman department store. The new building, designed in the Art Deco style that was coming into fashion, would rise higher and cover more of the lot than the mansion had. It would generate substantial rental income for its owners and substantial property tax revenue for the city. In economic terms, the redevelopment was a success, a more intensive use of valuable urban land, better aligned with the district's commercial character. The Vanderbilt Gate, removed before demolition, was stored by the city for several years before being installed at the entrance to the Conservatory Garden around 105th Street in Central Park. There, the gates underwent a transformation of meaning. No longer barriers to a private estate, they became ornaments at the entry to a public garden. Visitors passed through them freely, without invitation or admission fee, to reach flower beds and walking paths maintained by the city. The ironwork was the same, the craftsmanship unchanged, but the context had inverted, from exclusion to welcome, from private to public, from monument to memory. Architectural critics and historians, writing in the decades after the demolition, have interpreted the house's fate in various ways. Some emphasize economic determinism. The property was simply too valuable as commercial real estate to remain residential, and no amount of sentiment could override that fundamental fact. Others point to changing social attitudes. By the 1920s, the Gilded Age's ostentatious display of wealth was less admired than it had been a generation earlier, and the appetite for maintaining such houses, even among wealthy families, had diminished. Still others highlight the role of taxation. Property taxes based on potential commercial value, combined with federal estate taxes introduced in 1916, created fiscal pressures that made large urban estates increasingly difficult to sustain. All of these factors were operative, and their interaction was complex, but the fundamental dynamic was clear. The house existed within systems, legal, fiscal, economic, that treated it not as a permanent monument, but as an asset whose highest and best use could change over time. When that use changed, the systems exerted pressure for the property to be redeveloped. Taxes were the primary mechanism of that pressure, translating abstract land values into annual bills that had to be paid regardless of sentiment or history. The entrance hall's acoustics, that cathedral-like resonance that had impressed visitors for decades, was silenced in a few weeks of demolition. The St. Gaudens mantelpiece, salvaged and installed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, now presides over a public gallery instead of a private hall. The caryatids of Amor and Pax, their heads still bowed, their arms still raised, support a lintel that frames not a working fireplace, but a museum display, their meaning transformed from domestic luxury to cultural heritage. What taxes began, redefining the house as an asset to be optimized rather than a monument to be preserved, demolition completed. Yet the fragments that survived ensured that erasure was never absolute. The gates, the mantelpiece, the photographs, the architectural drawings, all of these remain, bearing witness to what was built and what was lost. By the spring of 1927, as wrecking crews systematically dismantled the Cornelius Vanderbilt II house, photographs captured the process in stark detail. Images show the mansion's interior exposed to the weather, walls half standing, the ballroom's oak paneling torn away to reveal structural timbers beneath. The entrance hall, that vertical canyon of Caen stone that had soared 5 stories, was open to the sky, its carefully calculated proportions violated by the jagged edges of partial demolition. In one photograph, the empty stone piers where the Vanderbilt Gate had once hung frame, nothing but air and the construction activity beyond. The sound of demolition dominated the block for months. Sledgehammers striking masonry, the crash of falling brick, the mechanical grinding of steam shovels scooping rubble into trucks. All of it was recorded in contemporary newspaper accounts that described the scene as controlled destruction and the methodical erasure of grandeur. Workers moved through the wreckage with practiced efficiency, salvaging materials that had resale value and discarding the rest. Marble was broken into manageable pieces for reuse or disposal. Ornamental plasterwork, too fragile and too specific to its original context, was destroyed. The carved oak paneling from the ballroom was partially salvaged. Some sections ended up in other buildings, others were burned as scrap. Newspaper coverage of the demolition reflected the ambivalence of the moment. The New York Times ran a feature article with photographs showing the house at various stages of destruction, headlined, "The End of an Era on Fifth Avenue." The piece noted that the mansion had been the grandest private residence in America, and that its replacement with a commercial structure marked the final capitulation of domesticity to commerce in Manhattan's most fashionable quarter. Yet the article also acknowledged economic reality. Land values had risen to such levels that maintaining large private houses on Fifth Avenue was no longer feasible for even the wealthiest families. The real estate pages explained the transaction in purely financial terms. The lot, measuring approximately 135 feet on Fifth Avenue and extending deep into the block, was valued at roughly $700 per square foot, an extraordinary sum by 1920s standards, but justified, analysts argued, by the location and the potential rental income from a well-designed commercial building. Property taxes on such a valuable parcel would be substantial, running into tens of thousands of dollars annually. But a successful department store could generate revenues more than sufficient to cover that expense while also providing a return to investors. Bergdorf Goodman, the retailer that would occupy the new building, was already a fixture on Fifth Avenue, but the Vanderbilt site offered an opportunity to consolidate operations and expand into a landmark location. Plans filed with the city showed an 8-story structure designed in a restrained Art Deco style, with large display windows at street level and setbacks at upper floors to comply with zoning regulations. The building would be a monument to consumption rather than to a single family, its interiors designed not for exclusive social performances, but for the daily commercial theater of shopping. Economic historians examining this transition emphasize the role of property taxation in facilitating urban redevelopment. When a property's assessed value is based on its potential commercial use rather than its actual residential use, the owner faces a choice: adapt, sell, or suffer the financial consequences of underutilizing a valuable asset. In the case of the Vanderbilt house, adaptation was impractical. The building could not easily be converted to commercial purposes without destroying the very features that made it architecturally significant. Selling and demolishing were thus the only economically rational options. The city welcomed the change. Municipal finance officials, quoted in contemporary reports, noted that the new Bergdorf Goodman building would generate higher property tax revenues than the Vanderbilt residents had, contributing to the city's ability to fund schools, infrastructure, and services. The logic was straightforward. A high-value commercial property, fully utilized, contributes more to public coffers than a large private residence, however grand. Yet, something was lost that cannot be captured in fiscal accounting. The Vanderbilt house had been a work of architecture, a coherent artistic statement executed over more than a decade by skilled designers and craftsmen. Its demolition represented not just the end of a building but the erasure of a carefully constructed aesthetic and spatial experience. The entrance hall's proportions, the ballroom's acoustics, the interplay of light and shadow in the Moorish smoking room, all of these were destroyed, irreplaceable, gone. Museums salvaged what they could. The Metropolitan Museum of Art received not only the St. Gaudens mantelpiece, but also some decorative panels, sections of carved molding, and architectural elements judged to have standalone artistic value. The conservatory garden would eventually receive the gates, but most of the house, its structure, its spatial relationships, its integrated decorative program, could not be preserved outside of its original context. Once dismantled, it ceased to exist as architecture and became only fragments, anecdotes, photographs. In one of the demolition photographs, now held in the Museum of the City of New York's collection, the ballroom is shown half destroyed. The far wall remains intact, its oak paneling still in place, while the near wall has been torn away, exposing the room's interior to the street. The contrast is stark. On one side, refinement and craft; on the other, raw structural members and piles of debris. The image captures the moment of transition between architecture and rubble, between a coherent vision and its dissolution. Contemporary observers noted the lack of public protest. Unlike the campaigns to save certain public buildings or churches, there was no organized effort to preserve the Vanderbilt house. This reflected both the practical difficulties. The building was privately owned, already sold and economically unsustainable, and the prevailing attitudes of the period. Preservationism as a broad cultural movement was still in its early stages in 1920s America. The idea that private buildings might have public value worth saving through government intervention or private fundraising was not yet widely accepted. The demolition proceeded on schedule. By early 1928, the site was cleared, Foundations for the new building were being laid, and construction was underway. The Bergdorf Goodman store would open within a few years, and within a decade, the Vanderbilt house would be remembered primarily through photographs and the few salvaged elements scattered in museums and private collections. The St. Gaudens mantelpiece, installed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in a gallery devoted to American decorative arts, greeted visitors in a new context. Amer and Pax, the marble caryatids, continued to hold up their decorative burden, but now they did so in a public space accessible to anyone who paid the museum's admission fee, or, on certain days, entered for free. The mantelpiece had been designed as the centerpiece of a private entrance hall where guests arrived by invitation. Now it was an exhibit, labeled and contextualized, explained to viewers who would never have been admitted to the house it once adorned. The transformation was complete, from private monument to public memory, from architecture to artifact, from functioning element of domestic space to museum specimen. The mantelpiece survived, but its meaning had changed utterly. What had once signified wealth, taste, and exclusivity now signified history, loss, and the impermanence of even the grandest human constructions. What taxes had begun, the slow financial pressure that made maintaining the house untenable. Demolition completed. The arithmetic that Alice Vanderbilt had struggled with for years was solved not through clever financial management or appeals to sentiment, but through erasure. The building that could not pay its way was replaced by one that could. The private castle gave way to the commercial palace, and the city, which had both envied and taxed the Vanderbilt house, welcomed its successor, calculating the increased revenue and approving the permits that authorized its construction. Across the United States, during the same decades that the Cornelius Vanderbilt II house rose, thrived briefly, and was demolished, similar stories unfolded with variations but a common pattern. The castles of America's Gilded Age, built to endure for generations, instead faced a combination of fiscal pressures, changing social attitudes, and economic forces that made their survival unlikely. The demolition of these houses was rarely dramatic, no revolutions, no mobs, but rather the result of quiet arithmetic and shifting valuations. Whitemarsh Hall, outside Philadelphia, was among the most spectacular casualties of this pattern. Commissioned by Edward T. Stotesbury, a banking partner of J.P. Morgan, the house was designed by Horace Trumbauer and completed around 1921. The project took 5 years and cost an estimated $10 million, including furnishings, a sum that contemporary observers noted could have built an entire neighborhood of middle-class homes. The house contained 147 rooms spread across a Georgian Revival facade of astonishing horizontality, with wings extending to encompass service courts, garages, and staff quarters. The estate originally covered 300 acres outside Chestnut Hill, landscaped by Jacques Graeber, with formal gardens, terraces, fountains, and naturalistic wooded areas. Inside, the public rooms were scaled for entertaining hundreds of guests, a ballroom, a 2-story dining hall, a library with carved oak bookcases, and a conservatory filled with rare plants. The basement held a swimming pool, a bowling alley, and extensive mechanical systems, furnaces, electrical generators, water pumps, required to operate what was essentially a small village under one roof. Stotesbury died in 1938 during the Great Depression, his fortune diminished by market losses and the costs of maintaining Whitemarsh Hall and his other properties. His widow could not sustain the house. The staff was dismissed, the furnishings sold, and the building stood empty for decades, slowly deteriorating as local property taxes continued to accrue. Various attempts to adapt the property, as a college, as a hotel, as a conference center, failed, stymied by the enormous costs of restoration and the difficulty of converting such a specific residential design to institutional purposes. By the 1970s, Whitemarsh Hall was a ruin, its windows broken, its roof leaking, its plasterwork collapsing. Vandals and scavengers had stripped anything portable. The once manicured gardens were overgrown, the fountains dry, the paths cracked and weed-choked. In 1980, the remaining structure was finally demolished, its marble and limestone broken up, its site cleared and subdivided for residential development. The demolition was recorded in local newspapers with regret but little surprise. The house had been unsalvageable for years, and the cost of restoration would have exceeded the cost of building new. Property tax records for Whitemarsh Hall, preserved in Montgomery County Archives, document the steady decline. Assessed values dropped as the house deteriorated, but the land retained value, and taxes continued to be owed. Without an income stream to pay those taxes, liens accumulated. The property became a fiscal burden on whichever entity held title, and no purchaser could be found who was willing to take on both the back taxes and the cost of restoration. In the end, demolition was the only economically viable option. Beacon Towers on Long Island's North Shore followed a different but equally instructive trajectory. Built in 1918 for Alva Belmont on a dramatic site overlooking Long Island Sound, the house was Gothic in style. Turrets, pointed arches, crenellations, executed in stone and stucco. The interior featured theatrical spaces designed for entertaining, including a great hall with a minstrel gallery and bedrooms, named after famous historical figures. Alva Belmont, a suffragist and socialite, used the house as both residence and political salon, hosting meetings and fundraisers for women's rights causes. After her death, Beacon Towers was sold to William Randolph Hearst, who occupied it briefly but found it too expensive to maintain, alongside his other properties, including San Simeon in California. The house passed through additional owners, each struggling with the same problem. The costs of operation, staff, taxes, insurance, utilities, exceeded any reasonable residential budget. By the early 1940s, with World War II creating labor shortages and material restrictions, the house was becoming untenable. Beacon Towers was demolished in 1945. Contemporary accounts note that rising property taxes and the impossibility of finding domestic staff during wartime made continuing the residence impractical. The land, subdivided, was more valuable than the house. Today, only fragments remain: a gatehouse, some garden walls, and foundations visible at low tide, traces of an architecture that briefly dominated the shoreline but could not sustain itself beyond a single generation. In Manhattan, other Vanderbilt houses met similar fates. The Vanderbilt Petit Chateau at 665th Avenue, built for William Kissam Vanderbilt and completed in 1883, was demolished in 1926, the same year as the Cornelius Vanderbilt II house. The Vanderbilt Triple Palace at 645th Avenue, which had housed William Henry Vanderbilt and his daughters, came down in sections during the 1920s and early 1930s. Each demolition was reported in newspapers as the end of an era, yet each followed the same logic. The land was too valuable for single-family residential use, property taxes reflected that commercial potential, and maintaining the houses was financially irrational. Economic analyses of estate taxation during this period show how federal policy interacted with local property taxes to accelerate the dispersal of large estates. The 1916 estate tax, though initially modest, established the principle that wealth should not pass intact across generations. Subsequent legislation raised rates and lowered exemptions, especially during the 1930s and 1940s. For heirs inheriting large houses, the combination of estate taxes at death and ongoing property taxes during life created powerful incentives to sell, subdivide, or donate. Property tax policy itself, throughout the 20th century, remained oriented toward capturing land value and incentivizing intensive use. Cities and towns depended on property taxes to fund basic services, and assessment practices aimed to reflect market values. In urban areas where commercial values exceeded residential values, this created a built-in pressure for redevelopment. Owners who maintained low-intensity uses, such as large single-family homes, on high-value land effectively paid a penalty in the form of taxes based on potential rather than actual use. Legal scholars examining these patterns describe them as taxation-induced obsolescence. The term captures the dynamic whereby fiscal policy makes certain land uses economically unsustainable even when the physical structures remain sound. The Gilded Age mansions were not demolished because they were structurally failing. Many were solidly built and could have stood for centuries, but because the fiscal system surrounding them made their continued existence as private residences economically irrational. The Vanderbilt Gate, by this time installed at the entrance to Central Park's Conservatory Garden, stood as a symbol of this transformation. Removed from its original context, the gate no longer guarded a private domain, but welcomed the public to a shared urban amenity. The ironwork was unchanged, but its meaning had inverted. Visitors who passed through the gate to reach the garden's flower beds and fountains were mostly unaware of its origin, but those who knew the history could read in the gate's repurposing a larger story about the redistribution of private grandeur into public heritage. By the late 20th century, the pattern of America's vanishing castles was complete. A few survived: the Breakers, Biltmore, Marble House, but typically only by transitioning from private residences to museums, tourist attractions, or institutional uses that could generate revenue or qualify for tax exemptions. The rest were demolished, subdivided, or left to deteriorate. The architectural ambition of the Gilded Age, which had sought to build permanent monuments to individual fortunes, collided with fiscal and economic systems that treated all property as provisional, all land use as subject to optimization, and all wealth as owing tribute to the community that made its accumulation possible. In the galleries of the Metropolitan Museum of Art on Fifth Avenue, not far from where the Cornelius Vanderbilt II house once stood, the Augustus St. Gaudens mantelpiece occupies a prominent place in the American wing. The piece is labeled Amer and Pax Mantelpiece, Yekaja 1881, designed by Augustus St. Gaudens, 1848-1907, marble, mosaic, oak, and cast iron, gift of Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, 1925. Visitors pass before it, often pausing to admire the carved marble caryatids, the intricate mosaic panel above, and the overall composition that blends sculpture, architecture, and decorative art into a unified whole. Most visitors do not know the full story. They see a beautiful object, skillfully executed, but they are unaware that these marble figures once presided over the entrance hall of New York City's largest private residence, that they greeted guests arriving by carriage through wrought iron gates designed by George B. Post, that they stood in a space designed to overwhelm through sheer vertical volume and material richness. The mantelpiece has become an artwork, contextualized, explained, isolated from its original function, rather than a working element of domestic architecture. This transformation, from functional component to museum exhibit, is typical of how fragments from demolished Gilded Age estates have been preserved and reinterpreted. Without the houses themselves, surviving elements take on new meanings. They become evidence of a vanished world, specimens of craftsmanship, illustrations of historical wealth and taste, but they are also removed from the spatial and social contexts that gave them their original significance. The Moorish smoking room ceiling from the Vanderbilt house, salvaged during demolition, was installed decades later in the lounge of a Connecticut movie theater. There, the ornate woodwork and plaster, originally designed to filter and decorate cigar smoke in an intimate masculine space, now hangs above rows of theater seats, its decorative ventilation grills non-functional, its context utterly changed. The ceiling survives, but its meaning has been scrambled, a beautiful object repurposed for an entirely different use. The Vanderbilt Gate, installed at the entrance to the Conservatory Garden in Central Park around 105th Street, underwent perhaps the most complete transformation of meaning. The gate, donated by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney after the house's demolition, now frames an entrance to a 6-acre public garden featuring Italian, French, and English landscape styles. Visitors, tourists, neighborhood residents, wedding parties seeking a photogenic backdrop pass through the gate freely, with no knowledge of its original function as a barrier to the Vanderbilt mansion. The ironwork itself is unchanged. The scrolls, the repoussé leaves, the vertical bars, all are as they were when the gate was fabricated in the 1880s. But the social meaning has inverted. Where the gate once marked exclusivity, it now marks welcome. Where it once guarded a private domain accessible only to the invited, it now opens onto a public garden maintained by the Central Park Conservancy and accessible to anyone. The transformation is almost perfect, from symbol of privilege to symbol of democratic access, from barrier to threshold, from monument to memory. Preservation organizations and museums increasingly interpret these fragments as essential to understanding the Gilded Age. Exhibition catalogs and wall texts frame them explicitly as evidence of a period whose excesses were ultimately curbed by progressive taxation, changing social values, and economic forces that made private castles unsustainable in American cities. The Metropolitan Museum's label for the St. Gaudens mantelpiece notes that it came from the Cornelius Vanderbilt II house, which was demolished in 1927 to make way for commercial development. A factual statement that nonetheless carries interpretive weight, suggesting inevitability and the triumph of commerce over domesticity. Academic studies of American material culture and architecture treat these surviving fragments as primary sources for understanding both the ambitions and the failures of Gilded Age wealth. The materials are analyzed: Carrara marble, French oak, Italian mosaic. The craftsmen are identified: St. Gaudens, Jules Allard and Sons, the ironworkers at Post's foundries. The costs are calculated and contextualized, but the analyses also emphasize the impermanence. These fragments survive because they were salvageable, portable, adaptable to new contexts. The houses themselves, too specific to their original purposes and too expensive to maintain, could not be saved. Tax documents, probate records, and demolition permits are now archived alongside architectural drawings and photographs. Researchers studying the fate of the Vanderbilt house and others like it find that fiscal records are often more revealing than aesthetic analyses. The assessed valuations, the annual tax bills, the trust account statements, the estate tax returns. These documents explain why the houses disappeared in ways that architectural criticism cannot. In a sense, the museums and archives have democratized access to the Gilded Age's material culture. Items that were once seen only by invited guests are now available for public viewing, study, and interpretation. The St. Gaudens mantelpiece, which once presided over gatherings of New York's social elite, now greets schoolchildren on field trips, scholars conducting research, and tourists from around the world. The transformation is not merely physical, but epistemological. These objects are no longer private possessions, but public heritage. Yet something is inevitably lost in this transformation. The spatial experience of the Vanderbilt entrance hall, the scale, the acoustics, the interplay of light and shadow, the procession from street through gate through entrance porch to interior, cannot be reconstructed from fragments. Photographs provide some sense of it, but they flatten three-dimensional space into two-dimensional images. They cannot convey the sound of footsteps on marble, the temperature differential between the cold exterior and the warmed interior, the physical sensation of moving through a space designed to impress and intimidate. Architectural historians have attempted to document these lost spaces through measured drawings, 3D reconstructions, and written descriptions based on surviving documentation. Some of these reconstructions are remarkably detailed, using floor plans, photographs, and written accounts to recreate the houses, virtually. But even the most sophisticated digital models cannot fully capture the phenomenological experience of inhabiting such spaces, the weight of history, the implicit social hierarchies, the performative aspects of moving through rooms designed as stages. Contemporary debates about preserving historic buildings often reference the demolished Gilded Age estates as cautionary tales. Preservation advocates argue that once a building is destroyed, it is gone irretrievably. No amount of documentation or salvaged fragments can fully replace the original. Critics of preservation sometimes counter that maintaining buildings that no longer serve viable functions is economically wasteful and that cities must evolve to meet changing needs. The fate of the Vanderbilt house and others like it suggests that preservation, when it occurs, typically requires finding new uses or transitioning buildings to institutional ownership with access to different financial structures. Private ownership of large historic houses is difficult to sustain because residential use generates no income to offset taxes and maintenance, while adaptive reuse often requires alterations that compromise historic integrity. Museums, in preserving and displaying fragments, perform a kind of cultural triage. They save what can be saved, interpret what survives, and acknowledge what has been lost. In doing so, they transform surplus into memory, converting the material residue of vanished wealth into educational resources and cultural capital. The tax system that helped bring down the houses, thus indirectly, populates public institutions with artifacts that would otherwise have remained in private hands. The motifs carved into surviving elements, the acorns and dolphins at the breakers, the caryatids of Amur and Pax from the Vanderbilt mantelpiece, are now symbols of a story whose ending is already known. They represent ambitions that were not fulfilled, permanence that was not achieved, dynasties that did not endure. Museums present them not as triumphs, but as evidence. This is what was built. This is what remains. This is what we chose, collectively, to preserve and interpret for future generations. In Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, Linwood Hall stands as a counterexample to the demolished estates of the 1920s and 1930s, a house that survived its original family, outlasted changes in ownership, and entered the 21st century still largely intact, but burdened by decades of deferred maintenance and complicated by ongoing battles over property taxation and use. Completed around 1899 for Peter A. B. Widener, the house was designed by Horace Trumbauer in a neoclassical style. White marble facade, Corinthian pilasters, a central portico, and symmetrical wings containing approximately 110 rooms. Widener, who made his fortune in public transit and investments, filled the house with one of America's finest private art collections, including works by Rembrandt, Raphael, and Vermeer. After his death in 1915, his son Joseph continued to occupy the property, but much of the art collection was eventually donated to the National Gallery of Art in Washington in 1942, removing from the house the cultural treasures that had partly justified its scale and expense. The estate originally encompassed 300 acres, but by the 1940s, portions of the land had been sold off to pay estate taxes and reduce the burden of maintaining such extensive grounds. What remained, the house and about 33 acres, passed through several owners over subsequent decades, including a period when it housed a theological seminary. Each transition reflected the same underlying problem. The building was extraordinarily expensive to operate. Its specialized residential design made adaptive reuse difficult, and property taxes based on the land's market value added a substantial annual cost. In the 1990s, the First Korean Church of New York purchased Linwood Hall with the stated intention of using it for religious and educational purposes. Such uses, if genuinely implemented, could qualify for property tax exemptions under Pennsylvania law, significantly reducing the annual fiscal burden. However, the church's actual use of the property became the subject of legal dispute. Local tax authorities argued that the building was not being used primarily for tax-exempt religious or educational activities, and therefore should be taxed as a residential or commercial property. The litigation that followed, extending over several years, revealed the complexities of property tax law and the difficulties of maintaining large historic properties. In 2006, Pennsylvania courts ruled that Linwood Hall did not qualify for full property tax exemption, finding insufficient evidence of regular religious or educational use. The decision left the church facing substantial tax bills, hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, on a property that generated no income and required expensive ongoing maintenance. To raise funds, the church sold elements of the estate, including a monumental fountain designed by Jacques Grébert that had stood in the formal gardens. The sale was controversial among preservationists who argued that dismantling the designed landscape was a loss to cultural heritage. But from the church's perspective, the choice was stark: sell movable assets or default on tax obligations and risk losing the entire property. The situation at Linwood Hall illustrates a dynamic that property tax scholars call fiscal stress on non-income producing properties. When property taxes are assessed based on market value rather than on the property's actual income-generating capacity or the owner's ability to pay, entities that use land for non-commercial purposes face disproportionate burdens. Churches, educational institutions, and historic preservation organizations all confront this problem, though tax exemption provisions exist precisely to mitigate it for qualifying uses. But exemptions are not automatic. They require demonstration of active use for exempt purposes, and tax authorities have incentives to interpret eligibility narrowly to protect the tax base. In Linwood Hall's case, the property's sheer size and its incomplete use by the church made exemption difficult to justify. A house with 110 rooms, most of which were closed and unused, could not easily be characterized as actively serving religious purposes. By the 2010s, Linwood Hall had deteriorated significantly. Photographs published in preservation advocacy materials show peeling paint, collapsed ceilings, water damage from leaking roofs, and overgrown grounds. The house, once among the finest in America, was sliding toward the same fate as White Marsh Hall: abandonment, vandalism, and eventual demolition. In 2023, after years of negotiations and preservation advocacy, the Linwood Hall Preservation Foundation, a nonprofit organization, purchased the estate for approximately $9 million. The foundation announced plans to restore the house and open it to the public as a historic site, with the grounds developed as gardens and event spaces that could generate revenue to support ongoing maintenance. The strategy is explicit and echoes successful models like the Breakers and Biltmore. Convert a fiscally unsustainable private residence into a public or quasi-public institution that can access different revenue streams: admissions, event rentals, donations, grants, and potentially qualify for property tax relief as a charitable educational institution. The foundation's business plan projects that with restoration and active programming, Linwood Hall can become economically viable, contributing to the local economy through tourism while preserving an important example of Gilded Age architecture. Yet even this preservation success story remains contingent. The foundation must raise millions of dollars for restoration, secure ongoing funding for operations, navigate local zoning and tax regulations, and convince the public that a house built for private luxury can serve public purposes. Property taxes, unless exempted or reduced, will continue to be a line item in every annual budget, a reminder that preserving the past requires continuous negotiation with the fiscal demands of the present. The acoustic quality of Linwood Hall's Great Hall, documented in recent preservation surveys, has changed from the sound of social gatherings to the echo of emptiness, and recently to the noise of restoration work: scaffolding being erected, plaster being repaired, systems being updated. The sound profile of the house tells its history. First inhabited, then emptied, then partially ruined, now tentatively reborn. Preservation advocates cite Linwood Hall as evidence that it is not too late to save America's remaining Gilded Age estates, even those that have been neglected for decades. Critics note that the house required a nonprofit intervention, substantial fundraising, and a complete reimagining of its purpose, and that such rescues are possible for only a small fraction of historic properties. The question remains: if every preservation effort requires this level of resources and commitment, how many buildings can realistically be saved? The story of Linwood Hall also highlights the ongoing centrality of property taxation to the fate of historic properties. Even as federal estate taxes have been weakened through higher exemptions and political resistance, local property taxes remain a fundamental revenue source for municipalities and school districts. Any property, no matter how historic or culturally significant, must find a way to pay its annual tax bill or secure an exemption. This simple fiscal fact determines which buildings survive and which do not. Contemporary property tax records for Linwood Hall, available through Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, show assessed values that have fluctuated over time as the property changed hands and deteriorated. At its peak valuation, the property was assessed in the millions of dollars, generating annual tax bills that would challenge even a well-funded institution. Current valuations are lower, reflecting the building's condition, but the taxes remain substantial relative to the property's inability to generate income in its current state. The Preservation Foundation's plans include applying for historic preservation tax credits, seeking grants from preservation organizations, and pursuing property tax relief through classification as an educational institution. Each of these strategies represents an attempt to negotiate with the fiscal systems that make maintaining large historic buildings so difficult. The foundation is, in effect, arguing that Linwood Hall should be treated not as a private asset subject to standard taxation, but as a public good deserving special consideration. Whether this argument succeeds, whether Linwood Hall can be preserved, restored, and opened to the public in a financially sustainable way, will be determined over the coming years. But the fact that such extraordinary efforts are required to save even one Gilded Age estate underscores why so many others were lost. Property tax remains present, no longer as executioner, but as a constant reminder that the right to keep a castle requires continued payment to the community around it, and that payment must be justified year after year to authorities who calculate tax bills based on market values and municipal needs rather than historical significance or architectural beauty. Today, at the northwest corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street in Manhattan, the Bergdorf Goodman department store occupies the site where the Cornelius Vanderbilt II house once stood. The building, completed in the late 1920s, is Art Deco in style. Geometric forms, setbacks at upper floors, large display windows at street level framed in polished marble and bronze. Shoppers enter through glass doors beneath awnings that bear the store's name in elegant lettering. Inside, the spaces are organized for commercial use: display floors, fitting rooms, escalators connecting levels, a spatial logic designed to facilitate browsing, purchasing, and the movement of merchandise. Nothing visible remains of the mansion that preceded this building: the marble entrance hall, the St. Gaudens mantelpiece, the ballroom with its oak paneling. All of it was cleared away, its materials scattered, its spaces erased. The tax parcel is still among the most valuable in New York City, generating substantial annual property tax revenue that supports municipal services. But the meaning of that value has changed, from a symbol of private dynastic wealth to a high-performing commercial property contributing to the city's fiscal base. At 105th Street, the Vanderbilt Gate stands at the entrance to Central Park's Conservatory Garden, framing a view of formal flower beds, fountains, and walking paths. The ironwork, now nearly a century and a half old, is maintained by the Central Park Conservancy, periodically cleaned and repainted to prevent rust. Visitors pass through the gate daily, tourists photographing the decorative metalwork, neighborhood residents accessing the garden, wedding parties posing for pictures. The gate is now part of the city's iconography, reproduced in guidebooks and on postcards, recognized as one of Central Park's architectural ornaments. For most who pass through, the gate is simply beautiful, an elegant piece of 19th century craftsmanship that enhances the experience of entering the garden. Few know its origin, and fewer still connect it to the mansion whose demolition it survived. The gate has been successfully recontextualized, its meaning transformed from exclusion to welcome, from private barrier to public threshold. Economic historians examining property taxation over the long span of American history note its continuity and its centrality. From the colonial period through the 19th century and into the 20th and 21st centuries, property tax has remained the principal local tax in the United States. Even as other revenue sources, sales taxes, income taxes, fees, and charges have been added to municipal budgets, property tax continues to provide the foundation of local government finance, particularly for school districts. The persistence of property taxation reflects both its advantages and its political durability. Property is visible, immobile, and relatively easy to assess. Land cannot be hidden or moved to avoid taxation. The tax generates stable revenue that municipalities can count on to fund ongoing services. And there is a logic, dating back to the earliest theories of taxation, that those who own valuable property should contribute to the public infrastructure and services that make that property valuable. Yet property taxation also creates the dynamics that shape the fate of the Vanderbilt house and others like it. By taxing based on assessed value rather than income or use, the system exerts constant pressure for land to be put to its highest and best use, the use that generates sufficient income to justify the tax burden. Large single-family residences on prime urban land, no matter how beautiful or historically significant, struggle to survive when commercial uses would generate far greater returns. Contemporary debates over wealth and taxation often invoke the Gilded Age as a point of comparison. Modern proposals for wealth taxes, higher estate taxes, or property tax reforms explicitly reference the period when great fortunes built private castles, arguing that such concentrations of wealth threaten democratic institutions and should be taxed more heavily. Opponents of these proposals warn of capital flight, economic distortions, and the difficulties of administering taxes on illiquid assets. The Vanderbilt House sits within this debate as both symbol and precedent. It represents what extreme wealth accumulation looks like when translated into architecture: grand, beautiful, but also excessive and ultimately unsustainable. Its demolition represents what happens when fiscal policy, changing social values, and economic forces combine to make such displays of wealth untenable. The house was not seized by the state, not confiscated through revolution, but simply made too expensive to maintain through the accumulated pressure of annual tax bills, estate duties, and the opportunity cost of using valuable land for non-income producing purposes. New luxury developments on Manhattan's Billionaire's Row, super-tall residential towers with multi-million-dollar condominiums, have prompted similar discussions. These buildings, designed for the ultra-wealthy, generate substantial property tax revenue, but also concentrate ownership in ways that echo Gilded Age patterns. Unlike the Vanderbilt Mansion, however, these modern towers are designed as income-producing investments rather than single-family residences, their owners often holding units as assets that appreciate rather than as homes to be occupied year-round. The fiscal treatment of these properties varies. Condominiums are assessed individually, and owners pay property taxes based on their unit's value. The amounts can be substantial, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars annually for the most expensive units. But for owners with sufficient wealth, these taxes are simply another cost of ownership paid from investment income or asset liquidation. The buildings themselves, as multi-unit structures, are economically rational in ways that single-family mansions never were. Architectural critics and historians looking at contemporary luxury real estate sometimes note the contrast with Gilded Age architecture. Modern luxury towers, while expensive and exclusive, lack the cultural ambition of houses like the Vanderbilt Mansion. They are investment vehicles and status symbols, but they do not attempt to create coherent artistic statements or to transplant European cultural traditions to American soil. Glass, steel, and concrete have replaced marble, oak, and iron. Views and height have replaced decorative programs and historical references. Yet in both eras, extreme wealth seeks to make itself visible through architecture, and in both eras, that visibility triggers debates about inequality, taxation, and the proper relationship between private accumulation and public needs. The mechanisms have evolved. Modern tax codes are vastly more complex than those of the 1880s, but the fundamental tension remains. How much wealth should be permitted to accumulate privately, and how much should be claimed by the community through taxation? The arithmetic that erased America's castles is not dramatic. Each year, an assessment. Each year, a bill. Each year, a decision. Pay, adapt, or sell. Across decades, these quiet choices proved more decisive than any protest or political movement. The houses fell not to revolution, but to spreadsheets. Not to ideology, but to the compound effects of annual obligations that eventually exceeded any reasonable private capacity to pay. In archival photographs, the Vanderbilt House looks indestructible. Solid limestone and brick, deep foundations, a structure built to last centuries. In tax ledgers, it is a column of figures, revalued annually, eventually overwritten by new entries when the property changed use. The photographs in the ledgers tell the same story from different angles. Architecture aspires to permanence, but property exists within systems that treat all uses as provisional, all structures as convertible back into economic value. The motif of the gate completes its transformation in the 21st century. Once, it marked the boundary between an elite interior and the public street, a threshold that most could observe but not cross. Later, during the brief period between the mansion's sale and its demolition, it framed an empty entrance, a doorway to nothing. Now, reinstalled at Central Park's Conservatory Garden, it opens onto public flower beds accessible to anyone. Its ironwork unchanged, but its meaning inverted completely. The gate is photographed constantly, by tourists, by artists, by couples getting married in the garden. It appears on Instagram, in travel blogs, in guidebooks. It has become, in a sense, more famous and more widely seen than it ever was on Fifth Avenue. But its fame is divorced from its original context. Most who photograph it do not know its story. Final reflection. Architecture is often described as frozen music, a metaphor that captures its formal qualities and aesthetic aspirations. But in the story of America's castles, architecture is also frozen capital, wealth transformed into material form, then slowly melted back into circulation through the steady heat of taxation, time, and changing social ideals. The Gilded Age attempted to solve mortality through marble and mansard roofs, to build dynasties in limestone that would outlast the industrial fortunes that created them. The response came not as dramatic repudiation, but as patient arithmetic. Annual tax bills calculated in municipal offices, estate duties levied at death, property assessments that captured rising commercial values, and legal structures that made preserving these monuments increasingly difficult across generations. In the end, what remains are not the castles themselves, but their fragments, their photographs, and the questions they leave us. The St. Gaudens mantelpiece presides over museum visitors rather than invited guests. The Vanderbilt Gate frames a public garden rather than a private entrance. The architectural drawings and floor plans document spaces that no longer exist, and the tax records preserved in archives explain why. The questions persist. How much permanence can wealth ever buy? What obligations does property ownership carry toward the community that makes property valuable? When does private grandeur become public memory? And when a society chooses, through its fiscal and legal systems, to prevent the emergence of permanent private castles, what exactly has been gained and what has been lost? The Vanderbilt House and the other American castles represent a moment when those questions were answered through action rather than declaration, through property tax assessments, estate tax rates, changing zoning laws, and the accumulated economic pressure that made grandeur unsustainable. No revolution declared that the age of private palaces was over. Instead, the tax bill came due year after year, and eventually the arithmetic spoke for itself. In the silence of demolished halls, in the fragments preserved in museums, in the gates repurposed for public parks, that arithmetic continues to echo. Every monument becomes history. Every structure, no matter how grand, exists within systems that determine its fate not through aesthetic judgment, but through fiscal calculation. And in the end, when the ledgers are balanced and the buildings are gone, what survives is not stone, but story. The memory of ambition, the evidence of impermanence, and the quiet lesson that time and taxation, working together, are forces no fortune can fully withstand.